Alright guys, welcome back, and now we're going to be looking at solving quadratic equations. Now, before I actually get into detail with this subtopic in algebra, I just wanted to point out something very important. Now, when we were asked to factorize, for example, x squared plus 4x plus 3, we're asked to factorize that. Now, this would be a quadratic expression, okay? This would be a quadratic expression. Now, if we're asked to solve this, okay, that's different. This would be referred to as a quadratic equation. So do not get them confused. You cannot solve for the unknown for an expression, okay? You can factorize, simplify an expression, but you can't solve for the unknown. Here we have an equation, and in this particular case here, we can solve an equation. So expression, equation. I can factorize this, right? I can simplify it if it needed to be simplified. It can be simplified here, obviously. But this is an expression we cannot solve for the unknown, meaning we don't know what the value of x is. We can't solve for x here. This is an equation. We can go ahead and solve for x because it's an equation. An equation means you can find the value of an unknown, right? So expression, equation, two different things, okay? So just pointing that out. So the focus again is solving quadratic equation, and there are several things now that you need to know before we can go ahead with solving quadratic equation. So let's get into that. Now, quickly. Now, quadratic equations are of the form ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. Now, if the quadratic equation was not organized in this way, where you have 0 on the right hand side, you would have to go ahead and rearrange it. What do I mean? So, let's say for example, you had this x squared plus 4x equals 3. Now notice it is a quadratic because again there's a square here, there is no index higher than the square, and there is no negative index. So we know it's a quadratic equation. It's a quadratic equation because there's an equal sign involved in the line. So we know it's a quadratic equation, but this quadratic equation is not in this form. In order for us to solve a quadratic equation, it must be in this form, and 0 must be on the right hand side. So notice now 0 is not on the right hand side here. So we'd have to rearrange this where, for example, we would bring over the 3 and then we would go ahead because now 0 would be on the right hand side. So similarly, just for argument's sake, if I had x squared plus 3x equals minus 2, that is not in the form that we want it in because 0 is not on the right hand side. I'd have to bring this over just for argument's sake and get it into this form before we can proceed. So 0 must always be on the right hand side. We must always have 0 on the right hand side. So quadratic equations are of the form ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. And before attempting to solve a quadratic equation, you should ensure that it is in the form shown above, okay? So it must be in the form shown above, where 0 must be on the right hand side and the left hand side looks like this, where you can easily identify A, B, and C, okay? So let's continue. Now, unlike linear equations, which you would have touched before you got to grade 10, unlike linear equations, which when you solve, you get one value for the unknown, when solving a quadratic equation, you will very often get two values for the unknown. What do I mean in a nutshell? Let's talk about that for a second. Now, back over by Melbourne, or in grade 9, when you are given something like this, x plus 7 equals 12, okay? And you're asked to solve this equation. Now, this equation is linear, and what that means is that if I were to represent this graphically, I would get some sort of a straight line graph. That's why it's called a linear equation. I'm not sure if your teacher pointed out that these equations are linear, but the truth of the matter is, if you were to represent this graphically, you would get a straight line. But we're not going to get into the graphical aspect of anything yet. But if I were to solve this, x would be equal to 12 minus 7, x would be equal to 5. One answer. One answer. Because it's a linear equation. Why is it a linear equation? Because if I were to represent this graphically, I would get a straight line. The quadratics are very different. So, if I had a quadratic equation, and by the way, this is the general form, so it's not specific. If I had a quadratic equation and I asked to solve it, at the end of the day, I'm going to get one answer here and another answer. Answer number 2 for the value of x. So when I solve a quadratic equation, I'm going to get 2 answers. And the difference between a quadratic equation, which is what this is, a quadratic equation, quad for short. When I solve a quadratic equation, I'm going to get 2 answers. When I solve a linear, I'm going to get 1. So that's a big difference right away. And also, this equation is linear because if you were to represent this graphically, you're going to get a straight line. But if you were to represent a quadratic equation graphically, you're going to get some sort of a curve referred to as a parabola. Later on in the topic, we're going to get back to that issue of graphing quadratic equations, but not right now. So just to understand, if you solve an equation like this, which is linear, you're going to get 1 answer. But in this topic, solving quadratic equations, when you solve this, you're going to see that we're going to end up with 2 answers. Okay. Next thing. How do we solve quadratic equations? Now, this is very important. Now, quadratic equations can be solved using one of these methods. Factorization method, and obviously we're going to start with this method because you just finished factorization, and it's going to be pretty easy for you to do this method. The new methods would be from 2 to 4. Quadratic formula method, completing the square method, and graphically, which we'll do later. So the focus of this topic now, solving quadratic equations, or the subtopic in algebra, what we're going to be doing first of all are these 3. Now, it is very important to note that not all quadratic equations can be solved by factorization method. So, the best bet very often in the exam is to use a quadratic formula method because the quadratic formula method works every single time. This method only works if you can factorize, and not all quadratics can be factorized. That's the thing. So you finished a lesson on factorization of quadratic expressions, and all that you got, you were able to factorize, but there are in fact some that you cannot factorize. So this is the one that works every time. This is the one that only works when you can factorize. All right, and completing the square, you're going to see the significance of this when we touch on sketching quadratic graphs, and of course graphically after you've done sketching quadratic graphs, you're going to get into this. So all of these methods are simple, but it's going to take a little time getting used to these methods in particular, but you'll see the importance of them for sure as we go on. All right, so these are all the methods that you're going to learn. We're going to be focused on 1 first, then 2, then 3, and then that's how we're going to move forward. So I'm going to end the video here before we actually look at an example and the different methods in solving that example when we come back. So ensure that these notes are taken off and put in the notebooks because they're extremely important. All right, I'll see you guys soon on the next video.